Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to open up with a quote. So there was a US Navy Admiral, Admiral Rickover, who said, "Learn from the mistakes of others. You'll never live long enough to learn them all yourself." And that's a challenge when we look at digital transformation. There's lots of companies trying to introduce technology, lots of different potential applications, and lots of mistakes to be made. And so what we want to do today is look at some of those challenges that companies have faced. So both from the perspective and primarily from consumers, those end users of the technology, but also companies that are selling technology. So a fundamental shift in mindset. How do you go around selling industrial IoT solutions to your customers as well? And so at IHS, we look at the industrial IoT space. So I'm specifically focused on the process and discrete industries, so everything from oil and gas through to electronics manufacturing. And one of the elements of our research is to look at how are people doing these projects. And the reality is one of the key challenges is start with technology. Sometimes we speak with companies and maybe the CEO says, we want to do digital transformation, and he throws that over the wall to his workers and they say, okay, great, what do we do with this? One of the key challenges is be specific. Know what the application is you want to introduce technology to. Don't lead with the technology. Don't get carried away with the shiny new toy, but understand how it will impact your business. And within the manufacturing space, there are certain key headaches that CEOs of manufacturing companies are facing. You know, how do we improve productivity? How do we improve our reliability? How do we deal with this challenge of brain drain, that retiring of the aging workforce and the skills and the knowledge that they have? How do we be a more sustainable company? And the reality is that when you look at industrial IoT, you know, a lot of the things that we hear in the early days or at this point where we are, it's around asset health, condition monitoring. But in reality, we see benefits across the entire life cycle of a project, of a product even. And so this is all the way from introducing new products through to deployment. I mentioned the unplanned downtime. Now, this is where we see the majority of applications being introduced today, majority of the projects. And you can see on average, companies achieve a 20% benefit, reducing their downtime. Now, this is an average benefit that we've calculated through tracking industrial IoT projects. Put that into perspective, in the automotive industry, every minute of downtime on a line is equivalent to $20,000 to $30,000. So very quickly, cost of downtime adds up. But as I mentioned, it applies to all different areas of a business. There was a company, many of you know, Harley-Davidson, who a number of years ago were really struggling in terms of meeting customer demand. I mentioned that issue of flexibility. Increasingly in the consumer space today, there's this demand for more product, more personalized design and product. And Harley-Davidson made a significant investment. They were struggling in terms of meeting customer demand, and they made this investment to really connect their factory, connect their enterprise, and they were able to reduce the time it took to introduce a new product from 18 months, down to 2 weeks, fundamentally changing that flexibility and meeting specific customer requirements. Some of the other challenges, obviously, productivity is always important, making benefits there. Being sustainable, an increasingly significant focus for companies. Can you reduce energy consumption? Improving the utilization of equipment. It's estimated that machine utilization rates sit somewhere around 40%. That means on average, you've got these large capital pieces of equipment that are just sitting unused. 40% of the time used, so more than half the time they're sitting on the factory floor not being used. So through getting visibility, you can optimize those manufacturing processes to utilize your capital investment. But it's not just in improving your manufacturing processes. Companies are looking at how industrial IoT can also improve revenue streams. If we look at where the market is today, equipment growth, typically you're looking at 2 to 4% maybe growth. The service opportunity is far larger than that. Combined with that, one of the big challenges today is we have an aging workforce. Many of the experienced engineers are retiring. Finding ways to help customers deal with that challenge is a significant opportunity for businesses, helping their customers deal with that transition. There's a lot of new business models coming into the market. We were speaking to a leading mechanical components company, and they were telling us, look, when competing with countries from the East, you know, we've always been unable to compete on price, but we've been able to compete on quality. But that difference, that delta is disappearing, and in some examples, product quality is no longer a differentiating factor. We need new ways of building relationships with our customer base. So looking at how services can help customers to close that relationship together. We've already touched upon earlier, Martin touched upon business models a little bit. There's a lot of business models out there in the market. Some of these are still being worked out. One of the really exciting ones, I think, is that outcome-based model. So this goes from moving from selling a product, so those big pieces of capital investment, to charging based on the performance of the product. So one of the more famous ones is that of jet engines. You've got companies like Rolls-Royce, GE, who have moved from a model of selling to their customer jet engines to selling as a service. And what they call it is power by the hour, where they will collect information on the health of the asset. They will take ownership of the maintenance, of the replacement, and they will charge for the number of hours that the plane is in the air. So a complete shift in mindset in terms of business. There's a similar example in the water purification industry, where instead of selling equipment, they started charging by number of gallons of water that are being purified. So that completely changes the business model. You now help companies by moving away from a CapEx model to an OpEx, so spreading those costs. But for a vendor, that also comes with a challenge. It's a fundamental mindset shift, moving from selling product to selling a service. So that influences marketing, sales team, accounting. So it really has an influence on the governance of organizations as well. But also you can extend your business. So motor manufacturers now are starting to sell motors with additional sensing on board, additional connectivity where they're monitoring the health of the motor, but not only that, they're then introducing additional services to support with energy management as well, to ensure the motor is being used at an optimal level. So these are some of the great benefits of IoT, and I think Arno touched upon, there's lots of different terms, should we say, for IoT, and analysts, we do tend to confuse the issue sometimes. So I wanted to be clear what we mean when we talk about industrial IoT. And really, we look at 4 pillars. So the first and the fundamental point is connectivity. If assets don't have connectivity, if you don't have the ability to derive data from your assets, that's the start or fail of any IoT project. A lot of interesting things happening with connectivity. A lot of noise, certainly around the industrial space at the moment, around things like how 5G is going to play into that as well. But when you've got that connectivity, what do you do with data? And this is really where we see a lot of companies getting to that point. Okay, we want to do IoT. Now what? Okay, we're going to collect a lot of data. How do we store that? Where's that going to sit? Is that going to be at the edge? Is that going to be local? Are we going to use a third-party cloud? But then when we've got all this data, we're talking about varieties of different data sources, and we have just a big lake of data. Well, how do we move from data into information and insight? How do we transition to being able to understand what this data is telling us? And ultimately, all of this is done with a purpose. You know, this is done to, whether it's creating new applications, creating new business models, it's the ability to either significantly improve or do something that wasn't being done before. And so this is what we're talking about. And when we talk about industrial IoT, you go to any trade show in Europe, if you go to a Hanover or SPS is coming up, I don't think there's a stand that doesn't have IoT or Industry 4.0 on the stand. Everybody's talking about it. And there's somewhat of a FOMO, this fear of missing out. Is everybody else doing it and am I not? Well, in reality, the market is still, we are still relatively in a nascent phase. So we look here and you can see majority of companies are either not considering IoT or they're still very much in that evaluation stage. And really we've seen the narrative shift over the last 3 to 4 years from should we do IoT, what the heck is IoT, to okay, we think we should, now what? What do we do? How do we go and take these next steps? And we looked at this, and what we wanted to do is identify where the industry is in terms of its roadmap of deploying these projects. So we asked companies, are they at that proof of concept phase? Have they moved to deployment? And while they're doing this, has this been successful? And what we found is that when trialing the proof of concepts, there was around 50% of companies that saw benefit or saw value from the project, another just below 50% that didn't. That's fine. You expect on that proof of concept phase, projects should fail. You're being agile, you're trialing new technology, seeing what works and what doesn't. What's significantly more concerning is when you move to full deployment. And here we see that even where companies have moved to deployment, they've gone through that piloting phase, they've deployed the technology, they've made some significant investments. In a still very high proportion of the cases, they're not seeing the value that was expected. And we're going to touch on some of the reasons behind that. I want to share some of the examples of companies that have deployed and what they've learned. One of the challenges we do see, though, is that of expectation. Certainly, some projects do deliver value very quickly, but in reality, there's a lot that can take, many projects, it's a 2 to 3 year payback before you start seeing value. But we found that in a survey completed, a quarter of all companies expected payback within the first 6 months, over half expected payback within a year. So just right setting expectations, and this is a challenge both for consumers of technology and for vendors, making sure there's a right expectation of how long these projects take to start generating value. But there's variety. So we looked at this by the industry as a whole, but we also looked at different industry sectors. And so this gives an example. The two industries that we saw as most advanced were those of the automotive industry, but especially the oil and gas industry. So the orange line here just shows the industry average compared to the oil and gas industry. And you can see here, proportionally, the oil and gas industry has more than double the number of companies already in deployment. So they're doing this. They're more mature along the roadmap. Even where they're deploying these projects, there's only a 50% success rate in terms of conversion. And when you look at the proof of concept, almost a third of projects are failing. Sorry, only about a third of projects are failing. There's a few reasons for this. Certainly, I think the oil and gas industry and the automotive industry have been heavily targeted by many vendors. What we see in some cases is these large companies have actually had to close the doors on POCs. They've got so many projects that they're trialing that they've simply had to close the door. And in many cases, even the vendor is having to subsidize the projects themselves. So a vendor is having to pay for the project to be run. So many projects, and just trying to get to a point of focus can be a challenge for some of these companies. So I mentioned the oil and gas industry. This was looking at the roadmap, so how far along the road are people? But what we also wanted to understand is, where are people today? In terms of their readiness, there's lots of noise, like I say, around. Everybody wants to do IoT. You see surveys that say X% of CEOs are looking at a digital transformation. There's a big difference between willingness and ability. Lots of companies want to do this. Do they have some of the fundamental things in place that will enable them to deploy? And so we have a benchmarking service that looks at the readiness of industry by different industries, by different regions, company sizes. How ready are companies to run projects? And this is based on 6 criteria. So we look at things like the network. What network do they have in place? Have they got the ability to connect the factory floor to the enterprise level to provide that visibility? Do they have specific cybersecurity elements in place? What are they doing in terms of the data? That's both in terms of how do they store data, how are they analyzing data? But it goes beyond technology. What are they doing with their people? What are the skill sets in place? How do they get departments to work together? That issue of the IT and the OT convergence. And even as I mentioned before, the governance as well. How do you change a company's mindset to consuming a service rather than a technology? Or how do you sell a service rather than a product itself? But we looked at different industry sectors. We found the oil and gas industry was the most ready. This means it had the criteria or the things in place necessary for a successful IoT project. Certainly since 2015, we've seen an acceleration in the industry around really becoming more digital. We saw the 2015 commodity price collapse. There was a focus on how do we be more cost effective, how do we improve extraction rates. The power generation industry was a close second. Again, this is an industry that has been doing IoT through things like condition monitoring long before IoT was a thing. You know, they've been monitoring the health of their assets. So that was another industry that was quite advanced. One result that did surprise us was the mining industry, because certainly many people will think of an example like Rio Tinto, and you think of the autonomous mines where you've got operators sitting a couple of hundred miles away from the mine, operating the mine. Really, I think this highlights an interesting point that, you know, industries aren't discrete in that sense. There's a lot of variation across an industry, and whilst you would have examples like the automated processes with Rio Tinto, if you look at cobalt mining in the Congo, that's still being done by a spade. So in some industries, there's still aspirational goals to hit Industry 3.0, let alone Industry 4.0. And so that's true across a multitude of industries. Certainly the automotive industry is another one where we see some very advanced facilities, but also other facilities are still trying to really figure out that whole connectivity element. So a range across different industry sectors. Now, I said I was going to address some of the challenges, but I wanted to throw out to the audience the challenges that people are seeing. So we've got a poll question. So if you could bring up the app on your poll. And so the question we want to ask is, what are the main challenges that you see in introducing industrial IoT? So if you're a consumer, you know, what are the pain points you have in introducing it? If you're a vendor, you know, what's that common problem that your customers keep coming up with? And reality is, there's many others. There's a lot of different challenges people are facing, but these are some of the most common. So what are the most significant challenges that you're facing today?
Different question.
We have a different question.
So there is a question earlier we skipped. If you want to quickly answer that one, it should move you to the next one.
Okay. So let's look at the other question. I won't give answers to the other question, I'm afraid. Maybe just an example. So one of them we didn't have. This is certainly frequently mentioned, but it's one that in previous surveys we've done hasn't come as highly as cybersecurity, and that's been mentioned earlier. You know, this concern of what's going to happen if I put my data on the cloud? What about if I connect? Are people going to hack into my facilities? The reality is that's a big problem. We found that 50% of manufacturing companies have had a cybersecurity breach in the last 3 years. So it's not to say cybersecurity isn't a big problem. It is. But a lot of the times it's not down to technology, it's people. You know, you get the person sticking in the USB stick or connecting their wireless kettle on the facility. It's people not patching devices or updating passwords. So I think, are we at a point of looking at the results? Okay. So we're seeing a fairly equal split between legacy equipment and data analytics. Oh no, sorry, between employee skills. That's better. That ties in with my results. Okay. So what, an exactly almost equal split, legacy equipment and employee skills, followed by challenges of that management of data and then analytics. And these we see as very common problems. So as part of our results, if we could jump back, we found these as the four most significant, the single most important challenge faced by companies. We asked companies to rank, you know, top 4, what's your biggest challenge, but also what are the most common challenges you face? Legacy equipment, the single biggest challenge, whether that's machinery, control systems, you know, in some of the process industries, there are control systems, DCS, that have been sitting there for 30, 40 years, and they don't want to update them. They don't want to interrupt the process. And these are products that have never been designed to be connected to the outside world. The challenges around collecting, analyzing data, we're going to touch upon that. And then the single most common challenge that was faced by companies is the people problem. It goes beyond technology. How do we solve that issue of the people? Providing the skill sets, making them trust the data. And so at IHS, one of the things we look at is equipment. We spend a lot of time looking at equipment, what's happening with that equipment from an automation perspective. Is it being connected? How's it being connected? And just to explain this, because I know there's a lot going on, we'll take the example of LV or low voltage motor drives in the top corner. What they're showing is that over 80% of drives that are sold have connectivity functionality on them. They're enabled equipment. But of those, less than 2/3 are actually being connected. And that's both field bus and Ethernet, if you're familiar with the networking. That's not even devices that are IP addressable. Of that number, probably half of that is IP addressable. So looking at that, we're talking about a legacy installed base of equipment that hasn't been designed with IoT connectivity in mind. There's still a challenge of bringing that technology. We certainly see it coming to far more products. You look at the motors market, companies are increasingly bringing that technology, that issue of connectivity to motors, even to things like switchgear. When we talk about things like circuit breakers and switchgear, they're even starting to see connectivity on devices. But getting people to use that technology is still a big challenge. People are still very wary of connecting everything up. So there's a large legacy of equipment just sitting out on the field, not able to be connected. So how do we upgrade that? How do we incentivize both an upgrade of facilities so they support the technology, but also how do we support workers to start connecting and seeing the benefits from connectivity? But then we start talking about volume of data, and we were speaking to one leading power generation company in the US, and they were talking about how they'd gone from a manual data collection process where they collected information on their assets twice a year, and they moved to an automated process where they were collecting data every 5 seconds. I just want to give an analogy. This is my local library. This is the Abington Library. 2 employees, 11,000 books, and not a lot else. Compare that to the Library of Congress. We're talking about over 3,000 employees, 160 million catalogued items. And when I say items, that's not just books. That's musical scripts, that's film, that's posters, all kinds of different types of items that they store. That transition from collecting data twice a year to every 5 seconds is equivalent to going from my local library to 10 Library of Congresses. That's a challenge. How does an organization move from not collecting a lot of data to all of a sudden this huge transition to collecting just a whole load of data? And how do we then, we're not just talking about one type of data, we're talking about a greater variance of data as well. How do we now get meaning from that data? There's a lot of companies that are still struggling. You know, we hear the term data lake. Sometimes it's a bit more like a data swamp. There's lots of data, but there's just not a lot of ability to infer what's going on. And so, really when we look at that, part of the situation around storage of data comes around to, should we use the cloud? I think the survey that Martin did earlier, there was a very small proportion of people that were maybe considering the cloud. We see there's still a lot of wariness around the cloud in the industrial space. You know, we still hear, you know, over my dead body will data ever leave my factory floor? You know, we're not sharing data, we're not connecting, we're not going to do it. People are very hesitant. Now, that's not always necessarily, I would say, an accurate mindset. Oftentimes in industrial environments, there isn't necessary cybersecurity in place. Industrial companies still aren't really making investments needed to make sure they're cyber secure. And I was speaking with Michael a while ago, and I gave an analogy. You know, if I was to give Michael or Martin maybe a briefcase in front of everyone with $1 million, would Martin go up to his hotel room and put it under his bed? No, he'd take it straight to the bank, because these are the experts in storing his asset and giving him access to his asset. And the same is true when we think about data. Now, there are companies, the cloud service providers, these are the experts in providing security to the data. And the attitude that data is safer locally isn't always an accurate mindset. That's not to negate the challenges there are around cybersecurity, but it's to understand putting it away somewhere else where it's safe may well be a better opportunity. But then the question comes, do we put everything on the cloud? Should we just use the cloud for everything? Well, we certainly see an optimal approach is one where it's a hybrid solution. We're talking about a combination of using the cloud as an element, but also using analytics on the edge as well. And where we see is really the cloud being used for a lot of the training of models. When we look at AI, we're talking about training models that are going to be then deployed locally at the edge. Because there's different elements and different needs. When you start thinking about latency, many manufacturing facilities have low latency requirements. They need that millisecond or below response rate. The cloud is not going to be able to provide that. You can't send all your data to the cloud forever. That's a very expensive mindset, I think. As was mentioned earlier, you start sending terabytes up onto the cloud, you're going to be hit with a pretty big bill soon enough. But at the same time, as you want to scale, as you're looking across multiple facilities, if you want to start bringing in learning across different elements, different divisions that you've got, different factories and facilities, certainly the cloud gives you that ability to scale. But where we saw the biggest challenge was, as I mentioned, people. The people problem is the single biggest challenge. You can throw money at technology and solve that problem. But how do you take people on the journey? And many of you may have seen the film Moneyball. And so Moneyball, it's a film about bringing analytics into baseball. And there was a team, the Oakland A's, they had the second lowest salary in the whole of Major League Baseball. And yet they brought in analytics, and within, I think it was a year, they were challenging the New York Yankees in the World Series based on analytics. But they had some challenges. And this is a quote from the movie where the director, he goes to the chief scout and he's talking about analytics, and the scout says to him, look, baseball isn't just about numbers. It's not science. If it was, anybody could do this. But they can't because they don't know. They don't have our experience. They don't have our intuition. And you could take baseball out and scout out, and you can put engineering and maintenance manager. And you'll have engineers that say, well, I just put my hand on the machine and I feel it, and I can tell if something's not quite right. How do you deal with getting people on board with the technology that you're using? Because as I say, you can put money at introducing technology, but the people have to follow. And so we had a discussion with a company, a different company in the US that was also in the power generation sector. And they deployed these technologies to 2 different facilities. And in one, the plant manager was really excited. He saw some of the potential, really got on board. In the other, very skeptical. I think he was coming towards retirement, didn't want to do anything to shake the boat and make it difficult. A year down the line, that project had mothballed, and the other one was starting to show some value from the project. So enabling people on this journey is key. There's a few things you can do. How do you train people? How do you get people involved to do this? There's some companies that have the mindset, you know what, it's not about our people. We're going to recruit in a load of data scientists, and they're going to bring meaning to all of our data. They're going to solve the problems for us. If that's the mindset, I've got some bad news. So a couple of years ago, LinkedIn did a survey on data scientists and found that there was a 50% shortfall in terms of supply of data scientists. Add to the fact that in the industrial space, we're not working in the sexiest of industries. This isn't a place where everybody's fighting to get to, compared to when you can look at medical or the financial industries as well. That mindset, we're just going to get data scientists in to analyze our data, it's a fool's promise. It's not going to happen for all companies. So it's really key to bring people within the organization on board. Not just because you won't get data scientists, but because your people are the ones that have that vertical expertise. They know what's going on in your facility. They can look and understand what correlates to the actual real-world challenges. So it's really a combination, but training is critical. We see a number of efforts that were made by companies partnering with academic institutes to train up data champions, people within the organization that didn't have the necessary skill sets initially, partnering with universities, bringing them up to a level where they could work with these technologies. Another company, they made some big investments in the UI, that user interface. They said beyond all the other technology we were deploying, we really focused just making it as easy as possible so that the workers would actually want to use it. We wanted to really get them bought in. Another company in Germany, a leading automation vendor, was trialing their own dog food, as they like to say. And they introduced these technologies, but what they did was they started incentivizing their workers to come up with applications as well. They found that 40% of the profit generated from industrial IoT solutions came from worker-led initiatives. And they actually released over €1 million in benefit, in bonuses to those workers that had came up with these new ideas. So bringing the people along, another challenge. So with that, I just want to round off with 6 S's for success. Here are 6 things, if you're looking to introduce technology, 6 things that you should be doing. Firstly, specify. Don't just throw out a load of sensors, collect the information, and say, okay, now what are we going to do with this? Have a pain point, have a problem that you're going to trial this technology on. Know what you're trying to do. Can you measure success? You need a benchmark. You don't want to roll out the technology, have an application, a year down the line, you're challenged, hey, is this providing value? And your best answer is, well, I think so. You want to be able to have that ability to mark, is this a successful project? Don't boil the ocean. Start small. Start with some proof of concepts, with some pilots, and then scale from there. Get senior support involved. This is critical. You're talking about converging different teams. The IT-OT convergence debate is very common. Here you're talking about very different mindsets, different agendas, sometimes competing for the same budget as well. Having senior support that can help overcome some of those points of inertia where maybe there's a bit of resistance, heels are being stuck into the ground. Having the senior support that can help overcome those issues is very important. But also on that shared responsibility, get your people working together. So I mentioned the issue of IT-OT convergence. One company we worked with, they actually swapped people across departments. So they actually took, I think it was their CTO, and they put him in the operational side. So he could understand the pain points from the OT guys and vice versa. So they learned each other's problems. But getting them to work together so it's complementary and not competing is key. And ultimately, like I say, get your people involved. The benefit is going to be, can you get your people to trust the technology and also not to see it as a threat? How do you bring them along on the journey so they don't see this as something that potentially is going to replace their jobs in 6 months to a year's time? So I think these are 6 lessons that we've learned. I hope that's useful, and just want to open it up now if there's any questions.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. Is the study that you mentioned somewhere available with more information on the data collected, like the number of organizations or companies that were questioned?
If you want to shoot me an email or hit me on LinkedIn, certainly share the details, but yeah, we have lots of details on that. Okay.
No more questions? All I can say is, Alex, thank you. It was very enlightening, very inspiring, a lot of really good information. One of the things you mentioned resonates really in terms of getting a consensus, getting people ready, trained, aware, aligned, without which nothing
goes to pot.
Exactly, and I think this is something essential. Alex, thank you so much.
Brilliant.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.